Okay, welcome today to Research Commons. I'm Chris Edmonds-Watson, a lecturer in the College of Education, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today Anna Lindblom from Karlstad University in Sweden, and she's going to be talking to us today about her research, her PhD research, and also plans for future research. So I'll hand it over to her to tell you more about that.
Yeah. All right. So my plan is to have the talk first, since we have this hour, and then if anybody has questions, we'll take them afterwards, if that's okay. And so I didn't really know what to name my presentation, but now I'm calling it Do Paradigms Matter? And how Western and Indigenous paradigms create different opportunities or obstacles for Indigenous students. I'm going to see if I can change it. And so if anybody wants, maybe I'll email my presentation to Chris or somebody, because if you want to access it, it has links to my articles and different things. So people could, and my email in case people want to contact me later on. If you're something like me, you'll wake up in the middle of the night and think of a question. Or, 3 years later, somebody said something about that interesting thing. So I like it when people get back to me after a talk. But before I start, I'd like to acknowledge and give thanks to the Indigenous people whose lands I'm visiting now, this beautiful country, and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. And also thank the university here and CDU for accepting me for this Erasmus teacher exchange. And so it's also possible then for somebody from here to apply for that exchange from Erasmus and maybe come and visit me, hopefully. So let's see. This is a bit of pictures, I guess, about me, my background. I'm Swedish, grew up in Canada, but I also have ties to the Lake Babian First Nations band. And before we start, sometimes I forget that different terminologies might be used around the globe. And when I'm talking about First Nations, there might be some confusion. Who are we talking about? And so in Canada, there are 3 Indigenous peoples that are recognized by the Constitution. And so the peoples that I did research amongst was First Nation, who we used to call Indians. But it's still used, the term Indian is used still in like the Indian Act and all these official documents. But more and more people are using First Nations. I guess the terminology we use also is towards trying to be as respectful as we can to the Indigenous peoples and using wordings that they would prefer. Well, a lot of First Nations I talked to, I said, well, what do you prefer, Native, Indian, First Nations? They'll say, oh, no, I prefer, and they'll say the name of their tribe, because that's how they identify. But probably even there, they would rather identify with their original name, because all these tribes, they have English names, right? They were given by the colonizers. And then there's also Inuit, and that's the people who used to say Eskimos. And there's the Métis, and they are descendants from when the first French settlers came. And they mixed with the First Nations there. And so they have their own name, they call them Métis. And so the First Nations are the ones that I did my research with. So I'd like to start off with an Indigenous presentation. And my name is Ann Lindblom. I was born Sjögren, or Sjögren, like we say in Swedish. And my mom was Anne-Marie and my dad was Sven. I was born in Karlstad, where our university is situated. But when I was 11 months old, my parents decided they wanted to move to Vancouver. And my dad had been out to sea since he was a young kid, and he'd been in Vancouver. So we moved there when I was just a young girl. And I grew up in Vancouver and the suburbs around there. I moved back to Sweden in 72 with my mom and my sisters. My dad and her split up. So I come from a multicultural upbringing, because in Vancouver, it's very, I guess, much like cities around Australia, that the people have come from all parts of the world. And I came back to Sweden where it was very monocultural, just basically only Swedish people. Maybe a few working immigrants from Italy or Yugoslavia. Otherwise, it's just Swedish people. But I also have another connection, family connection. I'm the stepdaughter of Beverly Perry, and she's a member of the Lake Babian Nation, the people that are called the Carrier. And their reservation is up in northern BC, in Burns Lake. And her and my dad had 3 lovely daughters, so that's my connection to the Indigenous people and how I got interested in Indigenous issues. Because growing up, they didn't teach us anything about the history of colonization in school. And if you go online, if you go on YouTube and you Google residential schools, you'll get these movies from the 50s or something where they portray residential schools like, oh, here are all these Native children going away to camp, and look, oh, they're getting their head shaved. And it's all like, ooh, this is so much fun. Look, they're playing hockey. And they're not telling the story about here, we're tearing them away from their families and taking their culture. So thanks to my First Nations family, I become more and more educated on these Indigenous issues. But in a more Western presentation, if I come to a different university in Europe or in the States or somewhere, nobody's really interested about the first stuff I was talking about, who my family is. They just want to know, what's your education? What's your academic title? What have you done? And it took me a long time. I like to say I'm a late academic bloomer. I started out as a hairdresser. So I'm the type of person who I was interested in something, and then I did that, but that turned out to be really boring, and then I find something new I'm interested in. So I've got a lot of different educations, and I worked in a lot of different fields. I was a newspaper reporter, or I cleaned at the hospital. I've done tons of different things. But I was always going back to people and talking, interacting with other people. And I did a lot of teaching without my degree and so on. So my first academic credentials was I took a degree in music therapy. And that's when I first got the idea to do research. And one of my teachers was doing research. And I thought, oh, it'd be cool to take this nonverbal music therapy and go up in northern BC and work with Indigenous kids who have school difficulties. But I didn't know what research really was and what I needed. But I need a lot of academic credentials to get there. So it took me 19 years to get accepted to doctoral studies. So that's how long it took. I got lots and lots of different education. So I'm a music therapist, a teacher in music and English, a special education teacher, and then I have a master's in special education, and I went on until I finally got enough credentials and experience. Also experience in writing, so you can write a good research proposal and get accepted. So 2 years ago, I finally got my PhD. And it's so funny when somebody says Dr. Lindblom, I'm always looking, who are they talking about? I haven't really realized that, oh, yeah, that's me. So I'm very proud of it. I'm the first person in my family to get a doctorate. And it took me a long time, but I didn't give up. And I'm pretty lucky that the people in Finland didn't have an idea what I was doing. I had pretty free reign, and I ended up calling my thesis "Stepping Out of the Shadows of Colonialism to the Beat of the Drum: The Meaning of Music for 5 First Nations Children with Autism in British Columbia, Canada." And so it's a very small picture of my thesis. They all look the same, the ones that come from that university. And I've also put a link for it online. So if somebody wants this presentation, they can get it from Chris later. And you can access all my publications. There's like 4 or something, but I'm getting there. So let's see what my next slide is. So I just wanted to show you a bit where I'm from. So this is a map of, I guess, Europe. And where that dot is, that's Karlstad. That's where my uni is. So if somebody ever was to apply for the Erasmus Teacher Exchange Program, or as a student, or I think even administrative staff could probably apply as well, that's where you would be going. And there's about 90,000, almost 100,000 people maybe in Karlstad. So I think it's pretty much the same amount of people that live around Darwin, isn't it? Something like that?
About 120,000.
Oh, you're bigger then. And Karlstad University is a young uni. It's only 20 years old, but it used to be a college before that. But it didn't get like the proper university qualifications, so they call it. And there's 260 doctoral students, 1,250 staff members on the uni, and about 11,000 students, and 2,000 of these are in teacher education. And so my field is special education. And so when I use the term indigenous, something I found when I was working on my PhD, and it's Sean Wilson is one of the indigenous researchers, and he says, well, it's a philosophical issue. It's about the philosophical assumptions, and says that just as a male can be a feminist, and a non-indigenous person as myself can use these philosophical assumptions in their research, or even as a practitioner. I'd like to think that, that we all should shift our minds, but we're not trying to take or extract what's not ours. So whatever is tribally or specific, or the specific protocols and traditions, cultures, we can't take that, extract that, but we could use these ways of knowing, ways of being, ways of thinking. But not all indigenous people think that way. Some people think that it's only for people, for instance, from that nation that should be, or from indigenous people should only be allowed to do research. And then obviously we have to respect that because, it's their entitlement. So that's a part of the indigenous research paradigm, is also acknowledging this white privilege that we don't think that we have the right always, if I want to do some research, that I think I could just go do whatever I want. Just to let people know where that came from. And so what I did was I tried looking from that. I had to make a paradigm shift. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But Sean Wilson from Canada, he's working down at Southern Cross University at the Guinea Indigenous College there. And they're working on indigenous research methodologies in health research over there. And so I've been inspired by that. Some other inspiration Yes, this will be a familiar face for all of you over here, probably. Linda Dewey-Smith from New Zealand. She's written the book Decolonizing Methodologies. She says there's a new one coming out. So when I met her here at the ERA conference, American Indigenous Research Association in Montana, she had everybody in the audience thinking about what is Indigenous research methodology. And then she came and took everybody's feedback because she's going to put it in, she's going to rewrite the introduction or something in her book, and she's collecting from people around the globe. Also, Sean Wilson, who's working down at Guinea. Yeah, I went to visit him a couple of years ago and here in Australia, but I've also met him a few times in Canada and the States. Oh, good job. So he wrote a book called Research is Ceremony, and there's a lot of good stuff in it. And he also is one I talked about who's been developing within health research this Indigenous paradigm. And he's going to be a part, if we get the funding for this new project that I'm working on, he's going to be one of the international reference group. And also Lori Lambert. So and it's her framework that I used in my thesis, and also that we'll be using in the SAMI project if we get the funding. And that's a picture of her book, Research for Indigenous Survival. And she actually, there's a few people there from Australia that she interviewed for her book. So she's talked to Indigenous peoples in different countries and, you know, talked about research methodologies and things like that. She was also one of the readers of my thesis. So I was lucky enough to have a lot of Indigenous knowledge holders helping me with my book, because no matter how hard I try, I'll still be always a Swedish person who is educated the Western way. And even though I think that I've written a text that is culturally appropriate or something, the cultural whiteness will still appear to a person that's Indigenous. So I've been very lucky that people have been helping me out. So this is the spiderweb framework. Appears a little bit small here, but so that's a framework that Lori built around Indigenous research. And you can find it on their website. You see that link up there. So they have a website. And I forgot to mention, but they also have an academic journal. So if somebody is writing something on Indigenous research, they can submit it to the new journal at ERA. And they have their conference every year in October. And they just last year changed it, so they have it on Indigenous Peoples Day. And so from her framework, I did my own development of it because I'm non-Indigenous, so I called it more of an Indigenous framework, where I just tweaked the wording a bit. And coming from the researcher's heart and place and passion and voice, mine obviously is a bit different. But you'll be able to see it better, hopefully, if you get it from Chris later on. It seems to be a bit pale or something. All right, so thing was, do paradigms matter? So when I was looking at my research, my idea was, you know, to go find First Nations children with autism in BC. And that's coming from a Western perspective. Looking back, I could see, you know, the shift is pretty obvious in my research. But my first idea was obviously from a Western deficit model, or perhaps from the social model as well. But the whole idea of a diagnosis is the Western deficit model. and autism, you're ticking the boxes, all the deficits, all the problems, difficulties that the person has. And what I want to explore more is an Indigenous model that we could use Indigenous philosophical assumptions instead as the lens we're looking through when we look at child diversity or when we look at kids in schools. Then. And then I realized maybe not everybody has an idea of what autism is. So I just very briefly say that it's thought to be difficulty with communication and interaction skills. And usually a person would have restricted interests and only want to work with that or do what they're interested in. It could be repetitive behaviors like turning the lights on and off, or if there's tap water running your fingers through the water, touching things in a repetitive way. But it could also be what you're saying the same phrases or something like that. But you can have these traits and still not need any extra support or something. So to get the formal diagnosis of autism, then you would need to have difficulties in your daily life, at work or in school, or like functioning with your family or something. And so if we look at the example of autism then, from different models, then a criteria for autism, when you're ticking the boxes, you'll look at, for instance, that they cannot make eye contact. But in First Nations, it's not appropriate to look your elders in the eye. So in their own context, they're actually being a good child if they're not taking eye contact. But in the Western perspective, in school, that's being seen as a deficit then, that you're not doing what you're supposed to. And in this one instance with a boy, they say he's nonverbal. But he says, for instance, ba ba, which in English is nothing. It doesn't mean anything. But in his language, it means grandpa. So when the teachers are communicating to the family, well, your kid isn't speaking, and they say, yes, he is. He says grandpa, for instance, and they probably have other words that he can say. But it doesn't mean anything to the dominant society there. That doesn't mean anything in English. So depending on the lens that we're looking at, we are going to see either as deficits or we're going to see strengths, right? And my last example here is walking on his toes, tippy toes, and so that's considered a trait of autism. Well, this boy walks on his toes, and they say, no, he's dancing. He's always humming and making sounds and like humming and musical noises. And in their culture, their dancing is first on their toes and then to the heel and toe to the heel. So he's in contact with the ancestors and the Creator. He's a bearer of our culture. He has it naturally, and he's dancing. So this would be a behavior that in his culture is seen as an asset. That's a strength. Wow. But in the school setting, it's seen as a deficit. So this is just, a little example about how the child would be viewed in a schooling setting where our worldview really matters. And if we're open to other people's, if we can talk to the parents and we can sort of embrace their worldview and ways of thinking, then it's easier for us to interact with this child. But if I'm very stuck in my own little narrow deficit view of what this child is doing, and that's going to be posing difficulties for the child. So what I found in my research, well, one of the things was, I thought, because I was sitting there in Sweden coming up with this idea. I had this idea for almost 19 years. It morphed a bit, but it was still the idea that I would go and see what's going on with the First Nations kids with autism in BC. And so when I turned up in Vancouver, I expected to go up to the school board, knock on the door, and they'd say, oh yeah, here are the kids. But apparently they had no children with autism from the First Nations communities in the whole of Vancouver. And I talked to researchers in the autism field, and they said, oh, is that what you want to do? Well, good luck with that. They're not going to find any kids. And if you do, they won't talk to you. So they won't let you in. But I was lucky that I have my stepmom and sisters, and they introduced me, and there's other family members that helped out. And so finally I found 6 families. But there was one family that didn't want to participate. So 6 families, that's not very much in the whole of BC. It's a pretty big, big province. So that made me have to look into what was in my first article. What are they saying around the globe? Why could this be? And so one idea is that, well, maybe they're living in remote areas and not being subjected to toxins, for instance, and things like that. But also living in more rural areas means they might not have access to facilities. So for some people, they would have to drive for 1.5, 2 days or even more to get to a facility. Because it used to be maybe just 5 years ago, they had to go to Vancouver, even if they were up from northern BC. So there would be a long distance to access any services. But also, if you did get the diagnosis, you may not have any services in your area, to get respite or have somebody work with your child, speech therapy, whatever. But there was also this, stereotyping. So, oh my goodness. So what was happening, countries were reporting, well, for instance, the First Nations, when they come in, the doctors see fetal alcohol syndrome. Because they're stereotyping. Here's First Nations, oh, they drink and they do drugs, so it must be fetal alcohol syndrome. So when they're doing all these testing, that's what they're looking for, and they don't see if there's autism traits or other things going on. They won't see it, right? And things like this, were appearing in research publications that I was trying to figure out what's going on in BC and Canada. Another thing that I found out is that in BC, they have 11 special needs categories, like intellectual disability or sight or hearing impairment and things. And the First Nations top all of these categories, except gifted and autism. And that apparently must be systemic or institutional racism, right? It's this, because we know that giftedness and autism, that would be spread across. Giftedness doesn't care if you have money or not, or, what ethnicity you have, and likewise with autism, it's supposed to be, across all peoples. So that's where the idea where probably the stereotyping and they're not getting diagnosed further for autism or something, or giftedness either. And one thing with BC, they have autism funding. So up till the child is 7 years old, they can get 18,000 Canadian dollars per year. They don't get it in cash in hand, but to buy services for their child. Speech therapy, like I was saying, respite, or somebody comes in and takes my child to activities and things like that. But if the First Nations children aren't being diagnosed, then if they actually have autism, they're being, cheated out of this funding. And for this one boy, So I was telling you about who's dancing. For him, he got his diagnosis when he was about 5, but the thing is, his mom was adopted by this family he was living with. They live on reserve, and the formal custody, they were giving them the runaround, so it wasn't finished. So they can't apply for the autism funding because he doesn't have formal custodians. So on paper, it would look very good, like he has all these rights, but the system is still made so he can't access this funding, for instance. And the Indigenous peoples, even if they live on the reserve and they are going to a tribal school, they're still dependent on the dominant systems, the school system, the health system, and the communication systems to get wherever. So if that's not working for them, it's working against them, then that's also a disadvantage. And another thing that a lot of publications are saying is that the diagnosis process in itself is not culturally sensitive. And if they're in Canada, for instance, well, maybe if they speak their language and aren't that fluent in English, they're getting diagnosed based on their English, right? So all the questions and everything and all the instructions will be in English. So that's another issue. And with the indigeneity, that you can't tell, just like with autism, you can't tell from the outside. It doesn't say autism on your forehead. The same with being Indigenous. And there's many faces that people look different. One of my sisters she has very pale skin, and she's people don't think she's Indigenous, but she is First Nation. So if you're faking it, if you're this cultural appropriateness, it means you have to think about it all the time, and it affects how respectful you are towards people and the way you behave, because you always have to think about who you're talking to and be respectful, because we don't know anything about me coming here, for instance, talking to new people. And if I'm saying things that's not appropriate, if this person was Indigenous, and then people will know that you're faking it, right? That you're not being truly open to all people. I think that's important, especially if we work with kids, because we have the possibility to open the whole world for them, but we can also make these barriers that make difficulties for them. So I hope this is making sense, and there'll hopefully be time for some questions afterwards. Otherwise, I'll just sit here and talk to people for a while. Sometimes it's difficult to know how much to say because you're wrapped up in your own thoughts and what you've worked on. So the paradigm shift I'm talking about is from a Western paradigm to an Indigenous paradigm. And initially, I wanted to do ethnography. I think it's Linda Tui-Smith that says ethnography is the dirtiest word in Indigenous vocabulary, because it comes from anthropology, right? And white man went out to the exotic Indigenous peoples, and they took artifacts and they took cultural things, and they also, when they depicted the Indigenous peoples, they did it from a Western mindset, so there was all this misinterpretation. And I wasn't thinking about that. I just had my research idea. And so when I went out and started meeting people and doing the research, and things started happening, not just in my head, but there was all these encounters with animals or dreaming and visions and things like this going on. And luckily I had Indigenous knowledge holders to help me figure this out. But when I was trying to put my thesis together, it was like I had this puzzle with pieces that weren't fitting, and I was trying to hammer it in there and make it go together. But what I was experiencing in my material didn't fit in with the paradigm. And it was pretty painful. So I actually, after my first trip doing field work, I had to go to see a therapist a few times because it was I was really anxious, and you're meeting people. And I stayed with somebody on reserve, for instance. And so if the word spreads around that you're a person doing your research in a good way, then people will come and talk to you. But if they think you're not doing it in a good way, then they won't talk to you. But here I am. I thought I was going to talk about autism, but people were coming in. I woke up in the morning, came out in my pajamas in the kitchen, and there were 2 First Nations women there making me breakfast that I didn't even know them, because the person I was staying with went to work. So 2 ladies showed up and made me breakfast, and then people started coming in and sit down with me at the table. I'm eating breakfast in my pajamas, and people start telling me their life stories and start telling me, you know, there was a lot of good stuff, but also terrible stuff. And it's like, okay, I haven't had breakfast yet. I'm not ready. I haven't put on my professional, almost Dr. Anne suit, right? Put on your armor. So it was all this, and that was happening, and I was right there on the lands and on their reserve, and, you know, experiencing what it was like there. So there was a lot of hard work going on up here and in here. And eventually, I ended up having to rewrite because I did my thesis by publication. So I had my 4 articles, and then I had to write sort of the summary. And I ended up having to rewrite the whole summary. So you could say that half of my thesis, or the beginning part, was more from a Western paradigm. And you could also see it by, I told you I met autism researchers, and there were a couple who said, oh, that's never going to happen. And then there was somebody else who said, oh, that's going to be difficult, but I'd like to collaborate, because there's been nothing done, right, regarding autism in the First Nations. But her idea of collaboration was, it would be cool to go out to a community and screen the kids for autism, right? And I thought, oh, and you know what it's like beginning as a researcher. Oh, somebody wants to collaborate with me here, right? Oh, that. So I thought, oh, that's really cool. But how many people do you think were interested in doing a screening of the community for autism? Nobody. Nobody wanted to do that. That's totally inappropriate. And this Western way of just applying the deficit model, right, on a whole community. So it didn't take long before I had to, you know, to have that conversation with this researcher. She still ended up being one of my supervisors from Vancouver, but you know that this is not going to happen. Nobody is interested. That's not, you know, appropriate for the Indigenous community. And so that's an example also about the ethical considerations you have to take all the time, continuously reflecting inwards and also outwards together with others. Is this, you know, how is this appropriate for the people that I want to work with? And I mean, just by saying that to somebody, you might have killed all your opportunities to ever work with those people, because, you know, that would be very invasive for them, somebody coming in and wanting to diagnose their kids. And also because of the history of the residential schools that the kids were taken from their families. And we think this is ancient history, but the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. So that's not very long ago. even though it was a day school at the time, but it's still in the walls, right? It's in the building, the colonialism. And then in the 60s, they had what they called the scoop. So they would go and scoop up the Indigenous kids and put them in foster care. So there's a long history of the white man coming in and taking their children. So it's not surprising that they would be a bit concerned if somebody wants to come and do research with their kids. Mm-hmm. So the thing that worked for me is what I wrote something about in the second piece on thoughts and experiences from ethnographic fieldwork with First Nations is in Sweden, for instance, it's not common for people to get their PhD at my age. It's usually they're younger. But for me, going in the Indigenous community in BC and being older was an asset because I am a mom, I'm a grandmother, I have a lot of life experience, and they could see when I came in and interacted with their child that I could to communicate with their child with autism, and that gave me credibility, which I think might have been more difficult if I came in as a younger researcher. But also coming from Sweden and not being a Canadian researcher was probably easier for me. And when they found out what I was interested in, it was like people were saying, don't let the authorities know what you're doing. If they find out you're trying to do good things for the First Nations, you better beware of the government. Right? They were a lot of times really concerned of what could happen because there's all these stereotypes of what it should be like. And also from, they call it the Highway of Tears. It's from Prince George and to Prince Rupert, and that's through the area where my stepmother comes from and the reserve is. And there's a lot of First Nations women who have disappeared or been murdered and raped along that road because there's bad communications, and even if there were buses, people might not have enough money. So even if they know it's not safe to go hitchhiking, that might be the only way they can, get from point A to B. So that was one of the obstacles. It was pretty scary out there driving by myself. But I have a pretty awesome story for that, because the first time I went just to check out if I could find people, I had my grandson with me, my oldest grandson. The second time, I was really concerned and scared. I didn't want to almost go there. So I convinced one of my sisters to come with me. And she had 3 kids, and they'd never been out of Vancouver. They'd never been out in the countryside. They'd never been to the reserve. So we were talking in the car about all this interesting stuff, and like talking about, we're going to go to the band office and, meet relatives and things like that. And they're from the Caribou clan, and we talked about different clans and stuff. And all of a sudden, we turn around a bend, and there's 3 caribou in the road. Like that's a big, it's like reindeer, but they're larger in Canada and the States, I guess they have caribou as well. And so we all got really excited. Oh, this is pretty cool. Look at the caribou, and we've got the cars full of Caribou clan people, and the caribou are right there in the road. And then after a while, okay, now we want to get going. So started honking the horn. Caribou weren't going anywhere. And I started to drive, really slow. Nope, they weren't going anywhere. But then a car came from the other direction. So then they started moving really slowly. And then one of them moved to the side of the car. So here we have 2 caribou in front, one on the side, and they're escorting the Caribou clan to their traditional lands. And it's like I get goosebumps just thinking about it. And when we got to the reservation, all the elders, everybody was, wow, that's so awesome. And the kids, they'd never seen a caribou. They'd never seen a bear, any wild animals at all. So all these kinds of experiences were happening. And, well, you could shrug your shoulders and say, oh, that was a funny coincidence or something. But if you choose to use an Indigenous framework and the philosophical assumptions that then we believe that they were there actually escorting the people to their traditional lands. So that's the type of experiences that were going on. So the last two articles are more from an Indigenous paradigm. And the third one is called It Gives Them a Place to Be Proud. And that's a mother who says about her daughter's class. It's an elective class they called Aboriginal class. And so this was a girl, she was 14 when I met her the first time, and she knew all the Taylor Swift songs and all the moves and all the, like, the popular songs. So her way of interacting with peers was she knew all the music. She was a very good singer and dancer. But nobody had thought through her years in school that they would use any Indigenous music. And I said, oh, well, she never asks for it. Well, if you have autism, you won't be taking initiatives maybe that much. So they were just going with the flow, whatever she wanted to listen to. All of a sudden, she went to Aboriginal class and made a drum. And they sang and played the drum. So I asked her, oh, well, how did you like that? And she said, oh, she liked it. Well, did you like it as much as the other songs you sing? Yeah, she said, I did. But nobody had asked her, right? And so that she was well known in the community, and they lived a more Western type of lifestyle, if you'd say urban lifestyle, and they had a lot of autism services, and she could hang out with peers at the after-school club and due to music, she could interact with them. Whereas the boy that I was telling you about earlier, who lives on reserve, they live more traditionally with 4 generations in one house, and the family taking care of him, they, like, one of them had the mothering role, one would take him to school and pick him up, and somebody else would take care of his more personal hygiene and things like that. So they were all taking different parts in his life. And he had no autism services, nothing like that. And nobody had thought for him either to use Indigenous music. But like I said, he was dancing, and he's always humming and making sounds, right? So one day it happened that his teacher was sick, or his EA, and he had a temporary assistant, and the principal said, well, why don't you do something? And they had a drum sitting around, so I took the drum and used a song that I'd been given, because it wouldn't be appropriate if I took an Indigenous song from his nation without asking or being given permission. But I have a song I was given that I can use. So I played the drum and sang. And all of a sudden, he's taking eye contact. He's looking me in the eye. He's taking the drum. We're playing together. He's taking the drum. We're taking turns and interacting. So all these things they say he can't do, he is doing when I'm singing a song that's very similar to, because in his nation, they use a hand drum that's one per, in some different nations, they have a communal drum, a big drum with many drummers, but the way I was singing and playing was very similar to his traditional music. So that gave him access to his competencies. So that's what that article is about. And the last one is about exploring autism. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll see you next week. Right. And then, so I just put a link to my thesis there. I don't know if I'll have time to quickly just say something about my results, but if you looked at the way the children use music, it would be typical. This could be, actually, if you looked at any teenager, it might be the same, using it for communication or relaxation, to feel safe and secure, happy. So this might not be different, but if you have difficulties within these areas, then music gives you access to be able to do this. That has a big impact. And ways they use music in different domains was one of my questions. So at home And at the after-school club for this girl I was talking about, they use music for motivation. So if you first do this math sheet, then you can go listen to your music or something like that. Like, we'll go sing, but first we need to do this. And in music therapy, also for this girl, there were goals about social interaction that they worked towards in music therapy. Otherwise, they listened to music or played instruments, and sometimes they were singing or dancing. And I was interested in inclusion since I'm in special education, right? There's lots of research that says music facilitates inclusion. None of the schools were using music for that purpose, even though these kids involved in my research liked music. They didn't use it for inclusion. In one school, also with this girl I was talking about, they said they had reversed integration. So when they had music therapy, they had a peer come in who didn't have a disability or autism or intellectual disability or anything. They came into the class, and they call that reverse integration. That was a new one for me. I don't know if it's popular around here, but that was different. I see, I misspelled traditional, but I think you'll get the drift. I'll fix it before I send it out. So nobody was using traditional music for the First Nations kids with autism. 2 of them had heard Indigenous music at home. But if you think that most of the Indigenous peoples there were estranged from their cultures, so they might not be listening to their own music, First Nations music at home. There was one of the kids who actually participated in cultural activities and powwows and potlatches and things with his family. And here's a picture when we're playing the drum together. And so my conclusions were that music was important and the music interventions lacked in cultural sensitivity. And although music can be beneficial for inclusion and motivation of pupils with autism, it wasn't used for that purpose. And I also concluded that if we did use culturally sensitive music interventions, that would be a way of respecting the child's rights and contributing to decolonization and also helping them with their reciprocal relationships with all in creation. I also wrote another article with a couple of colleagues using some of these examples how you can show within research then a child gets the opportunity to show competence or incompetence by the methods you use. And it's just like teaching, the methods that I use will allow the kid to participate or not. So I just put that in case somebody was interested. There's a link. So the last few minutes, I'd just like to say a few words about the grant application that I'm supposed to submit before Tuesday. Good timing to go to Darwin, eh? So I'm working on that. And so the blue part there is Sápmi. That's where the Sami people are from in northern Sweden, but also Norway, Finland, and Russia. So that's Sweden, our Indigenous peoples. And I'm working together with Ylva Janoknutti, and she works at the Sami University of Applied Sciences, which is a pretty cool place. You should at least look it up online. Oh, here we go. There's Ylva, and she works at the University of Applied Sciences. So all their teaching is in Sami. And we have Sami schools in Sweden. and there are state schools. There are 5 Sami schools, and education should be given in and on North, Lula, and South Sami, and Swedish. So Swedish is like, they have the same curriculum as the Swedish schools, and there are some extra components that are with the cultural bits. And so what we want to do is look at Sami ontologies and child diversity and see how we're going to try to build an indigenous framework instead of special education framework, so based on the Sami ontologies. And that's because we could tell there's recently been an inspection on the Sami schools, and they found some problems with the special education. But the thing is that most of the teachers and special education teachers are not Sami and maybe don't speak Sami and are not cultural bearers. So that the teaching would be coming from the Western perspective. And that's what we would like to investigate. Could there be other ways of doing it? And we want to, of course, address decolonization. And in Laurie's Spiderweb framework, and the one I adapted, the Indigenous framework, it says empowerment. But Ylva has put in the input self-empowerment, because if you say empowerment, it sort of implies that I, as a teacher or a researcher, I'm giving you the power, right? But self-empowerment, that is coming from the people themselves. And that's different. So it's, and I had a presentation in the beginning of my research about giving voice. No, we're not giving voice. The people have their voice. And, you know, they should be able to use their own voice. So the self-empowerment is, that's what been one of the changes in the framework. And that we want to build on Sami knowledge, and that the children should be able to walk in different worlds. And what is Saminess can be different for every child, how much Sami culture they have in their families. And they might be meeting very different worlds in school and at home, and they must be able to walk in these different worlds. All right, so that was my last slide. And I don't know if we'll stop the recording, and if somebody, or did you want some questions? Okay, and they'll just edit it.
Either edit it or not edit it.
Right, okay. So did anybody have any comments or questions or something? It can be a bit overwhelming sometimes to think of something to ask straight off the bat.
Just talk.
Okay. One thing that I'm just curious about when you are conducting this study, do you have any issues or problem with communicating with the indigenous people about such matter? Because sort of they might be thinking that there are area of field, and you probably as a Westerner stepping into such field, do they have any have you encountered such situation before?
Do you mean that they were concerned or something?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because
Well, there was one family, the one that didn't want to participate. I think that they thought that their son was doing fine and didn't want anybody to come in and meddle with.
To make it more explicitly, like in Canada, are there any Aboriginal organization, like whether it's Aboriginal health organization or Aboriginal such committee? Because in Australia, there are also such and in NT too, there are also such Aboriginal health organization as well.
Right.
And sometimes some of the representatives will feel that the things that the researcher do might not be reflective of the indigenous perspective.
Yeah,
but
that's sort of why, because it was my idea from a Western perspective. But what was good was that people were doing something with music. They know that music is important for my child.
mm-hmm.
And that I was interested in seeing what are they doing right, not like coming in and try to see what are your people doing wrong. And that, because if I come in with a different perspective, they might have been afraid, what do you want, why is this research
mm-hmm.
being done? Do you have ulterior motives?
Yeah.
Who is she going to report this to? Is she saying she's looking at autism, but she's going to come in and see what our house looks like, right? But there, I think it was helpful for me that I have my First Nations connection.
Yeah.
I think otherwise I probably wouldn't have been able to do the research.
Yeah.
Because that was my first gateway. But I think it was also important that when I interacted with their child, they saw, for instance, that boy I was talking about, first time he saw me, he came up and he leaned on my shoulder.
Yeah.
So he accepted me being there. And then it's easy for his family to accept me as well. And the girl I was telling you about when I came back 2017, and I hadn't seen her for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
She, Anne, and came and gave me a hug. Mm-hmm. And so then it's easy for her mom also to, to talk to me, because that gives me credibility that her child can interact with me.
I've got a question about the music connections. And was there anything in your work that showed any differences or similarities between the examples you gave? It seemed to me were drawing upon traditional music in a pure sense, that the drum and the song, I think, that you're talking about. Are there any connections to the fusions between traditional music and contemporary music in a Western sense? For example, in Aboriginal society in Australia, there's been a lot of uptake of Western styles, but based upon traditional foundations. Was there anything in your work that showed anything about that?
Nobody was using it. But it might have been that boy that speaks some words in his own language, but not in English. His the grandmother figure in that family had the Aboriginal TV on a lot, so he might have heard it there, but it was nothing that came up in any of the discussions.
So, thanks for your presentation. It's really, really interesting. Really, some nice stories amongst it, and all of that. And Greg's questions sort of enabled me to ask mine now. I wasn't sure whether I'd ask it. I'm interested in the whole question of paradigm and how we work with that when we're doing our research and our PhDs, and how we have to declare the paradigm that we're working in. And I was interested in the way that you're sort of framing that up with distinctiveness between an Indigenous versus a Western paradigm. And so, leading on from Greg's question about the fusion space, I'm really interested in what scope you might see for some kind of trans-paradigm thinking, what your thoughts might be about that.
Yeah, so maybe you could say that would be sort of like the Indigenous framework that allows me as a non-Indigenous person to use a philosophical assumption. But I mean, a lot of the methods would be the same. I mean, you could still use a conversation. I call it conversation in my thesis. Mm-hmm. You could still use that. But the philosophical assumptions would be different. So it could be conversations with you, but I might also actually have had conversations with those caribou, or with the ancestors, or with the bear cub that comes to me in my dreams. when I'm on the lands out there. So it's the philosophical assumptions that somebody said when I was presenting at a conference and she was presenting on another thing, if you have a vision, for instance, if I had a vision now, I could use that. That could be part of my method within an Indigenous framework. But in the Western framework, send the ambulance to pick me up. And so, don't say you're having a vision. You're seeing things. No, because in a Western paradigm, that's, then you're nuts or something. You can't be seeing, hearing things. So it's the way you think about it, and visions or dreams and ceremonies, things you experience in ceremony could be used as a method.
Okay.
But the difference is I could use it if I participated in a ceremony with you guys, for instance, but I could only use the parts that aren't specific to that nation. So I said, you could use a philosophical assumption, and we might have similar experiences. The difference would be that I would be having it with whatever is here. Maybe, perhaps my ancestors would be involved, but probably not. But an Indigenous person would have, all the past and present peoples and with the Creator and the lands and everything else. But it could look like we're participating in the same thing. Sort of, I could spend more years trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
But as of my understanding is now that's the way I've been using it.
Okay.
Yeah. But I might not have written it all up because some parts maybe, because Indigenous knowledge holders have also advised me about things that I should not be talking about, even with my own personal experiences, and they say, well, you don't understand that yet, so you can't write about it. Did you have
Yes. Can I ask, did you experience any communication barrier throughout your research? For example, did you require any translator?
No. Everybody spoke English.
Oh.
Yeah.
And
so that's something with our Sami project, since we have a Sami knowledge bearer, Ilva is one of the researchers. So the participants or the research partners that we like to call them, they can choose if they want to be have their conversations in Sami or Swedish.
yes. And just another question, sorry. In the Western model again, they always like to involve therapists or psychologists to do pre-intervention and post-intervention kind of assessment. Did you do any of those things, or maybe you?
No, because I wasn't initially. My goal wasn't to do intervention. It was, to see what's happening, see what's going on. But then I followed up, so I went 2013, and then 2014, 2017. I'm going back next year, and then 3 years after that. So I'll be sort of following up, but not doing interventions per se, but seeing, the progress, what's going on.
Thank you.
We might finish up there. We've got a little overtime.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you very much. And
Thank
you'll
you.
be around till
Thank you, Anne.
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, sorry, Bea. Yes, you've got a question?
No, I was just going to say thank you. It was really interesting. It was really interesting perspective and the way you had used your framework and model the task.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I heard half of that, so thank you. I hope it's all positive things, I hope.
Okay,
Right.
thanks. Thank you very much. And you'll be around till
All Wednesday.
into Wednesday.
Yeah. All righty then. Now I can exhale.
Thank you, Anne. That was so interesting.
Thank you very much. And I'll see if we have time to catch up.
I don't know if you remember me.